Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Every week in Australia, a child is bashed to death. As a survivor of extreme childhood violence, I know why this happens and I know how to stop it. Women are raped and murdered. And having grown up around extremely violent, brutal thugs, I know why this happens and I know how to stop it. We have an enormous ice epidemic in Australia. We have an enormous drug epidemic in Australia. We have an enormous alcohol epidemic in Australia. We have an enormous violence epidemic in Australia. We have an enormous depression epidemic in Australia. We have an enormous epidemic of people taking antidepressants. I know why this has happened, and I know how to fix it. When my father smashed me in the head hundreds and hundreds of times with a metal shifting spanner, or a pair of multi-grips, or a piece of wood, or whatever else was at hand, when he said, "You fucking cunt, I'm going to fucking do you." When he said, "I will fucking cripple you." When he said, "I will turn you into a bleeding fucking heap." When the violence seemed absolutely endless. When it seemed there was no escape whatsoever. And I was lying on the floor, trying to cover myself up, and he was looming above me. And he seemed taller than the sky. He seemed absolutely enormous. And his hand would seem to come from high up in the heavens, just smashing and smashing and smashing down on me with his shifting spanner. And he'd say, "Get your fucking hands away from your face, you little cunt. Get your fucking hands out of the way." So I had to pull my hands away so he could hit me in the head with a shifting spanner. And the more I tried to cover myself up, the more violent he would become, the more he would hit me with this metal thing. When a shifting spanner hits you in the skull, the blow is so unbelievably hard. There is so much weight in that shifting spanner, it is moving so fast. The blow is utterly horrifying. I've been hit many thousands of times in the head with a shifting spanner. I did go to the police about it, but they refused to help me. They called my violent father to pick me up and take me home. So the police can't help with violence, but I can. And I read about a woman who went to the police because she'd been raped, and the police refused to help her, and they called up her rapist and got her rapist to come to the police station and take her home. So the police don't help rapists either. There is a case in the media of a man who has committed multiple incidences of sexual assault in New South Wales, and now he is living in South Australia. But the police refused to cooperate in order to remove him from South Australia to bring him to New South Wales for trial. Absolutely disgusting. The police cannot help. The legal system and the courts are useless. The politicians and the media cannot help, but I can. When my father smashed and smashed and smashed me in the head and all over my body with a shifting spanner and lumps of wood and all sorts of other things, even though I wasn't religious and I didn't believe in God, I used to pray and I used to try and bargain with the universe. Please let me survive even if I only have one eye and one arm. I'd start off saying, "I don't care if he paralyzes both of my legs, please let me just survive with just the use of my arms and my eyes." And then as the violence got worse and worse and worse, as he kept hitting and hitting and hitting me, I would be saying, Please let me survive, even if I just have one arm and even one eye. Just please let me survive, even if my body is totally paralyzed except for one arm and one eye. And I'd be begging and begging and begging in my mind, trying to bargain with the universe. You know, let me survive as long as I have one eye and one arm. Sometimes, as he was hitting me, I'd try my hardest to distract my mind, but when something so horrifying is hitting you so unbelievably hard in the head, there's no way to escape this horror. But sometimes I would see an insect's wing lying on the ground. And I would imagine that insect wing was the size of the entire horizon, and I was standing upon it. I'd imagine I had shrunk millions of times over, and I was standing on this enormous insect wing, and it stretched out forever and ever and ever, silvery and shimmering, and with all the little green or blue colored veins in it. I would imagine walking along the veins of this enormous insect wing. And after a time, I would imagine what it would be like to be inside the veins of this insect wing. And I would imagine walking along inside the blood vessels and seeing all of the blood cells and seeing all the immune system cells and the antibodies. Then I would imagine that I was inside a blood cell. And I would imagine I could see the DNA in the cell mitochondria and the DNA in the nucleus of the cell. And I would imagine myself walking on that double helix spiral. I would imagine those proteins and their molecules growing bigger and bigger and bigger until I was standing on the surface of a proton or the surface of an electron. And I would imagine going down inside that proton and seeing the up quarks and the down quarks. And I would imagine my body getting smaller and smaller and smaller, or the particle getting bigger and bigger and bigger, until I was surrounded by an almost infinitesimal number of quarks. A vast number of quarks sitting on their lumpy gluon field with the flux tubes between them. And I would just imagine existence getting bigger and bigger and bigger. By taking my mind away from the violence, by taking my mind to another place, my curiosity managed to make my mind very calm. And by taking my mind to other places, and by relentlessly studying, reading, and exploring the universe, by relentlessly studying, reading, and exploring the world and the universe that we live in, I was able to take my mind away from the violence, and I was able to imagine and eventually create a future without violence. I've read a great deal of criminology, and in thousands upon thousands of cases, people had extremely violent childhoods, like my own, and then they went on to become extremely violent criminals. The violence I have survived is so extreme and has had such a devastating effect on my mind that I have struggled with every single social interaction, every single job, every day of my life. But I saw very clearly that extreme violence and having no escape, having nobody on your side, having nobody believe you, having nobody want to help you, I saw very clearly in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of cases, this extreme violence created people who were unimaginably violent, full of unimaginable levels of rage, who committed unimaginable atrocities. And I have fought and fought and fought my entire life not to end up unimaginably violent, not to commit unimaginable atrocities. And my escape from extreme violence was to broaden my mind. My escape from unimaginable violence was to read about the Himalayas, to read about the Sahara Desert, to read about the endless icy wastes of the North Pole, to read about Greenland and Baffin Bay, to read about the gold rush in the Klondike, to read about dog sledding across the Yukon, to read about the Great Lakes of Canada, to read stories of people who crossed mighty oceans, to read about Alexander Selkirk, who was marooned on an island for a long time, and that inspired the story of Robinson Crusoe. By reading all the classics, by reading about history, by reading every travel magazine, by reading every National Geographic, by reading every possible article, by learning about all the great civilizations, by learning about great achievements, by relentlessly expanding my mind, I've escaped unimaginable violence, and I have escaped the almost certain path of going from abused to abuser. The secret to escaping sickening levels of violence. The secret to escaping a life from hell is to relentlessly broaden your mind. Learn to play a musical instrument. Read history. Learn about 1,000 different jobs. Learn about the most extraordinary places in the world. Learn about the most extraordinary things that have happened in history. Because the violent thugs that I grew up around had tiny minds. Broadening your mind can save you from a life of pure living hell. Giving yourself an enormous mind can give you an extraordinary life. I know. It worked for me. It can work for you too. But the mindless thugs I grew up around, many of them had violent fathers and violent mothers, and all they saw from a young age was their parents swearing at each other, giving each other death threats, saying I'll effing murder you and all of that. Their parents were extremely physically violent and extremely abusive and swore non-stop. Their uncles and aunts were extremely physically violent and physically abusive and swore non-stop. And everyone they knew was extremely physically violent, extremely abusive, and swore non-stop. But more than that, these people had traveled to almost nowhere in their lives. They spent their entire life in the same few locations, their lounge room, the local pub, their friend's house. But even if they did go on holidays, it would be the same location their entire life. It never occurred to them to travel to a different place. It never occurred to them to read a single book. It never occurred to them to show any interest in anywhere or anything else whatsoever. If I saw a National Geographic magazine and it had a story about Africa, I would be fascinated. And I would say to them, look at all the fascinating things in Africa, but they couldn't care less. It didn't exist in their suburb, didn't exist right in front of their eyes, so they couldn't care less. I would say, look at this extraordinary story of this person who sailed around the world. They couldn't care less. Didn't exist in their life, didn't exist right in front of them, so they couldn't care less. I'd say, by Jove, I want to go to Tibet. Look at these extraordinary mountains. They couldn't care less. The only thing they were interested in was doing, saying, and thinking the exact same things they had always done, said, and thought. They had zero interest in ever expanding their minds, and their minds were smaller than you can ever possibly imagine. Tiny minds create extreme levels of violence and rage. Tiny, tiny minds create extreme levels of violence, rage, jealousy, hypermasculinity, and utter stupidity. The total inability to learn from experience and the total inability to learn from other people, the total inability to learn from other cultures, other places, other countries, other times, and to modify your own behavior to change your own life. But the secret to happiness in life is to give yourself the biggest possible mind. And it starts by reading your very first sentence about India, about Antarctica, about the weird creatures at the bottom of the ocean. It starts with that one thing we've had for millions of years that modern people have turned away from: curiosity. It begins with you saying, I wonder what it's like a long way away from here. I wonder if there's a better life out there. I wonder if there's a better life somewhere else. I'll go and find out. Small minds create jealousy, rage, and violence. Large minds lead to calmness and happiness. For the love of God, enlarge your mind. Nobody ever regretted broadening your mind. But I've lived among the most violent thugs imaginable. They hate their lives, they hate their partners, they hate their families, they hate everyone else, and they hate their existence. And they refuse to broaden their minds. So they are doomed to spending the rest of their lives in hell. They are doomed to regretting their pitifully small lives and their pitifully small mindsets when they are lying on their deathbeds. Expand your mind, take risks, broaden your horizons, because that is a path to a happy and fulfilling life. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My name's William Flynn. I'm running for the New South Wales Senate at our next election. Cheerio.